She survived a crash that was meant to silence her. But instead of stepping back, Judge Clara May made a decision. She would tear down the very system that tried to bury her. They slapped the wrong woman, and now she's about to put the entire House of Power on trial. But how far would she go, and what would it cost her to bring the truth to light? Let us know where you're listening from, and what made you stay. Now, take a breath. Because this story begins where justice almost ended. It wasn't the screech of tires that woke the neighbors. It was the sound of metal folding into metal. Sharp, final, like a verdict. The black sedan had flipped twice before landing upside down, steam rising from its crushed hood like smoke from a dying fire. Glass glittered across the pavement. A mailbox had been torn from its roots, and inside that mangled wreck was Judge Clara May. The paramedics couldn't believe she was alive. Not after a direct hit from the passenger side. Not at her age. Not in that condition. But somehow, she was. When they pulled her from the wreckage, her pulse was faint but steady. Her left arm was fractured, 3 ribs cracked, and blood matted the silver strands of her hair. But her eyes were open, focused, silent, but unbroken. The crash report would later call it a road hazard, a freak accident. Loss of traction in wet conditions. But that's not what Clara believed. Not after she saw the tire marks. Not after she realized the cameras on that corner, cameras she had approved funding for herself, weren't working. Not after she remembered the envelope. Because 48 hours before the crash, someone had slipped a plain white envelope under her office door. No return address, no markings, just a single piece of paper inside. And one sentence, typed in bold, "Some questions are better left unanswered, Judge." She'd laughed when she first read it. A low, humorless chuckle. She'd received threats before. It came with the robe, and she never took them seriously. Not until now. Because this wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The night before the crash, she'd walked through her chambers slower than usual, her heels echoing down the marble hallway. Something had been bothering her, a feeling she couldn't shake, like a whisper behind her shoulder, like a shadow that didn't belong. She didn't tell anyone, not even Carter, her longtime bailiff. Not her sister, not her pastor, not her late husband's picture on the wall. She just stared at the envelope again and filed it away in her drawer. And now, 2 days later, she was lying in a hospital bed, her arms suspended in a sling, her face bruised and swollen, her breath shallow, but calm. They thought this would scare her. They thought they could silence Clara May. But they forgot who she was. Clara May was not just a judge, she was the judge. The first black woman ever appointed to the circuit bench of Charleston County, South Carolina. 62 years old, 3 decades in law, a former public defender, a former prosecutor, a widow, a survivor. She had outlasted 5 police chiefs, 2 mayors, and more than a dozen bad men with clean records. She carried herself like history. Quiet, firm, unshakable. Her presence alone could still a courtroom. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't need to. But now, someone wanted her gone, and they just sent a message in glass and steel. So the question is, who crashes a judge's car in the middle of the night? Who risks a federal charge to send a warning this loud? And more importantly, what truth was Clara May getting too close to? Because whatever it was, it almost got her killed. And Clara? She's not backing down. She's getting started. The hospital room was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the sterile kind. Artificial. Humming with the low, constant buzz of fluorescent lights and heart monitors. The kind of quiet that made you feel like someone had muted the world, just for a moment. Clara opened her eyes slowly. Everything hurt, but nothing felt broken enough to stop her. A nurse stood nearby, clipboard in hand, polite smile already fading. "You're lucky, Judge May," she said softly. "That impact, it should have been worse." Clara tried to speak, but her throat was dry. The nurse offered water. Clara took a sip, then whispered, "Was it an accident?" The nurse paused, just for half a second, but it was long enough. An hour later, 2 uniformed officers entered the room. Not detectives, just beat cops sent to check in. The taller one, Officer Henley, did most of the talking. The other stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the hallway more than Clara. "We just have a few routine questions, Your Honor," Henley said, opening a thin notebook. Clara nodded slowly. "Go ahead. Do you remember what direction you were headed?" "Yes. Did you see any vehicles following you?" "No. Do you recall the impact? I remember the sound, she said. Like something hit me, not the other way around. Henley hesitated. Our preliminary report suggests you may have lost control in the rain. It wasn't raining, Clara said flatly. Another pause. Henley forced a polite chuckle. Well, moisture on the road sometimes lingers. She let him finish. Then she asked calmly, what did the traffic cameras show? Henley blinked. Pardon? The intersection. There are city cams on every corner of Rosemont and Calhoun. You know that. He glanced at his partner, then lied. Unfortunately, the footage wasn't available. System glitch. They're looking into it. Clara looked him dead in the eye. Of course they are. That evening, a familiar face appeared in the room. Jackie Everett, Clara's old friend and former legal partner, now one of Charleston's top defense attorneys. She walked in with flowers, designer heels clicking sharply on tile, and eyes that scanned Clara like she was reading a brief. You look terrible, Jackie said, then added, but alive, so that's something. Clara smirked faintly. Thanks for the reminder. Jackie sat down, setting the flowers aside. I saw the crash report. Already? Of course, it's Charleston. I have ears. Clara raised an eyebrow. And? Jackie leaned in. Don't push this. Clara's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. Jackie went on, softer now. Clara, I know you. I know how your brain works, but I also know how this city works. You dig too deep, you might not get a second chance to walk away. Clara turned her head slowly to look at her. I wasn't planning to walk. Then at least be careful, Jackie said. You're not invincible. I never was, Clara replied, but I'm not afraid either. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clara asked, almost absently, Did Carter call? Jackie nodded. He's been at the courthouse all day. Said he's checking on something. Clara closed her eyes for a beat. The kind of silence that comes when a woman has already made up her mind. That night, after Jackie left and the nurses dimmed the lights, Clara stared up at the ceiling. Her body ached. Her face was sore, but her mind was razor sharp. She knew what this was. Not an accident. A message. And she wasn't going to ignore it. They tried to break her bones, but all they did was sharpen her resolve. So while the city slept, while the files were buried, while the cameras stayed offline, Clara May made a decision. She would find out who wanted her gone, and why. But most of all, she would make sure they regretted not finishing the job. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the Charleston courthouse, casting long, soft shadows across the marble floors. The air inside the courtroom felt dense, like it knew something big was about to happen. People filled the benches, journalists, attorneys, clerks, everyone expecting just another day of arraignments. Routine, predictable. But today would be anything but. Judge Clara May stepped into the room quietly. She wasn't wearing her robe. Just a simple navy blouse, a gray skirt, and a silk scarf around her neck. Subtle, composed, even elegant. But no robe meant no authority, or at least that's what some assumed. She moved toward the clerk's desk to skim through a file. Calm, focused, eyes steady, even with bruises still fading on her cheek from the crash. And then he walked in. Sergeant Travis Boone, clean-cut, mid-40s, and wearing his arrogance like a second badge. He didn't glance at Clara. Didn't acknowledge her at all. Instead, he barked across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. Let's get this over with. I've got better things to do. Clara didn't react. She kept reading. Boone didn't like being ignored. He stomped over, towering a little too close, voice sharp. I'm talking to you, you with the file. You here for the defense? Clara looked up, just for a moment, then returned her eyes to the papers. That's when it happened. A loud, open-handed slap cracked through the courtroom. The sound of skin on skin silenced everything. Papers froze mid-rustle. A coffee cup stopped halfway to someone's mouth. Even the light seemed to flicker. Clara didn't move. She didn't touch her cheek. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, straight into his eyes. Calm, unblinking. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt the shift. Boone stepped back, almost surprised by what he'd done, but not sorry. You people need to learn some respect, he muttered under his breath. From the back, someone whispered, Oh my God. Another voice, is she okay? But Clara never broke eye contact. She stepped forward, slowly, her presence expanding like thunder about to break. And then, she walked up the stairs, not rushed, not shaking, each step deliberate like a countdown. She turned, faced the room, and in one motion, pulled her black robe from a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders. The silence in the courtroom stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. And then Clara spoke. Her voice was calm but sharp enough to cut steel. "Is this how you treat officers of the court, Sergeant?" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone dropped a pen. The court clerk's eyes went wide. Boone blinked, stunned. "Wait, what are you talking about?" Clara looked him dead in the eye. "You just struck me, in this courtroom, without cause," he stammered. "I didn't know who you were." "That's not what I asked." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It just landed. "I asked you a yes or no question, Sergeant. Did you lay your hands on me?" More murmurs. Someone started recording. Phones went up, quietly but certainly. Boone looked around, desperate for support. No one moved. No one came to his rescue. Then Clara said it, clear, cold, and unforgettable. "If I were a white male judge sitting here in full robe, would you have slapped me?" Boone's silence was the loudest answer he'd ever given. Clara let that silence settle, let everyone in the room feel its weight. "Thought so," she said. "You just assaulted a sitting judge, in front of witnesses, under court surveillance." At the back of the room, a small red camera light blinked, recording everything. And in that moment, the power in the courtroom shifted. Not just because a cop made a mistake, but because the woman he underestimated refused to stay silent. Clara stood taller. The gavel hadn't dropped yet. But judgment? Judgment had already begun. The envelope was cream-colored, unassuming. But Clara knew, the second she saw it sitting on her desk, that it carried the weight of something rotten. Inside, one sheet, official seal, cold language. "Judge Clara May is hereby placed on temporary administrative suspension pending review. Concern has been raised regarding judicial impartiality related to the arraignment of Sergeant Travis Boone." She read it twice, once as a lawyer, then again as a woman who had just been slapped in her own courtroom. The second reading hurt more. When Carter walked in, he knew something was wrong. Clara didn't have to say a word. She was standing still, too still, staring at the wall, holding the letter like it might burn through her fingers. "They suspended you?" She nodded once. Carter cursed under his breath. "I knew they were spinning things, but this fast?" Clara looked at him. Her voice was even, but her eyes had gone somewhere colder. "They're not investigating Boone. They're investigating me, because I reacted." "You didn't even raise your voice," Carter said. "That's not the point," Clara replied. "I made power feel threatened, and power never forgives that." Later that evening, while Clara sat reviewing old case notes, Carter returned, with news she didn't want to hear. "It was her," he said. Clara didn't look up. "Who?" "Your assistant. The new one. Dana." Clara froze. "She copied your files, everything you've been compiling, sent them straight to ADA Ramsey's office." The words didn't register at first. Dana. Bright. Loyal. The one who brought her coffee with the right amount of cream. The one who called her ma'am out of respect, not obligation. The one Clara had defended during her first brutal month on the job. "Are you sure?" Clara asked, though her voice had already sunk. "We traced the access logs," Carter said quietly. She gave them everything. Clara leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she just stared at the ceiling. Not angry, not yet, just tired. "They didn't just come for my title," she murmured. "They came through the back door." But the worst wasn't done. That night, Clara was alone in her home office. The windows were dark, the house quiet. Her laptop screen glowed with unread messages. Then her phone buzzed. A text. No name, just a number. Attached, a photo. A boy on a bicycle. Backpack hanging low. A quiet neighborhood street. It was her nephew, 11 years old, coming home from school. Clara's blood ran cold. Under the photo, "Keep pushing, and the kid gets caught in the fire." She sat still for a long moment. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from shock, but from restraint. Her fingers gripped the phone tighter until her knuckles went white. This wasn't about her anymore. They'd come for the one thing she couldn't shield with a robe. The one thing she couldn't argue for in court, her family. Her breath came out slow, controlled. Then she stood, walked to the safe in her office, entered the code. Inside, a black binder, her war chest. Every complaint, every sealed document, every name that shouldn't be on the bench, every whisper that had become a pattern. She placed it on her desk, then looked at Carter, who had just stepped into the doorway, face pale. "I want a press conference," she said, "tomorrow morning." "Clara," They suspended me for doing my job, for being struck in my own courtroom, for telling the truth. They're trying to paint you as unstable, emotional, biased." She smiled grimly. "Then let's show them exactly what it looks like when a woman like me finally stops holding back." Carter hesitated. "Once you go public, there's no going back." "I'm not going back," Clara said. "I'm going forward, with fire." She looked down at the photo one more time, then deleted it. "Tell every reporter who still has a conscience to be there. 8 a.m. sharp." She didn't sleep that night. She didn't need to. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. They tried to shut her down. Now, she would make sure everyone heard her voice. The press conference was set for 8 a.m. By 7:30, the steps of the Charleston courthouse were already crowded. Reporters with cameras, city officials pretending they weren't watching, courthouse staff whispering behind coffee cups, and then Clara stepped out. Not in her robe, not with a bailiff behind her, just Clara. Black blazer, pearl earrings, chin high, she stood behind a plain podium. No slogans, no banners, just truth. She didn't clear her throat, didn't pause, she simply began. "Good morning. I am Judge Clara May, or at least I was, until the system I served decided that a woman demanding accountability was more dangerous than a man abusing power." That first line sent a shiver through the crowd. Then she opened the black binder, the same one from her desk. One by one she read out cases that had been buried, complaints that were sealed, names of officers protected, 15 excessive force reports, 7 against black defendants, 3 sealed body cam files, 5 complaints dismissed by the same prosecutor, Carson E. Ramsey. Gasps, camera shutters clicking, reporters scribbling like their pens were on fire. All of these cases have one thing in common. They involve Sergeant Travis Boone, and they were all pushed through by a network of silence that runs deeper than one courtroom. Then Clara paused, turned a page, and dropped the hammer. And here is the signature of Judge Benjamin Halcraftoft, my mentor, the man who swore me in, the man who taught me to fight fair, while quietly signing off on dismissal after dismissal tied to the same corrupt officers. The crowd froze. That name meant something in Charleston. Halcraftoft wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol, untouchable. Until now. Clara didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, she just said, "No one is above accountability, not even those who taught us the rules." By noon, her name was everywhere. Cable news anchors were calling it a reckoning. Some praised her bravery, others called it a career suicide. But by 3 p.m., it got worse. A headline appeared online. Radical Judge Clara May tied to anti-police groups. Then another. Photos surface of Judge May at protest, questions raised about impartiality. The photo was grainy, old, Clara at a student march, fist raised, no violence in sight. But the headline told a different story. By nightfall, bots flooded social media. Radical Judge May must resign, protect our cops. A news segment aired a heavily edited clip of Clara's press conference, stripping out facts, keeping only her quote, "The system I served decided I was dangerous." They framed her not as a truth teller, but as a threat, a problem, a symbol that needed to be erased. But Clara didn't flinch. She knew this wasn't about her. It never was. That night, Boone was arrested. Federal agents cornered him in a downtown parking garage. He reached for his belt, reflex not intent, but they didn't give him the chance to escalate. He was cuffed without a word. And as they drove him away, he kept repeating one thing. "You don't know who I know. You don't know who she's messing with." But the truth was, Clara knew exactly who she was messing with. And she wasn't finished. Back in her chambers, Carter closed the blinds while Clara reviewed the flood of threats now coming through her email. Some subtle, some vile. And then her phone rang. Blocked number. She answered. The voice was familiar, male, smooth, almost kind. "Clara, it's Ben." She didn't respond. "I imagine you've seen my name." Still, silence. "You think this is about Boone? It's not. You pull this thread too far and the whole damn tapestry unravels, and when it does, there's no putting it back together." Clara finally spoke. Then maybe it was never worth keeping. Click. He hung up first. That night, she sat alone in her office. Outside, the city buzzed. Protests, news vans, speculation. Inside, just her, and the binder, and the storm she had started. Carter walked in and said nothing. Just handed her a printout, 12 more sealed complaints. Same names, same patterns, same rot. Clara nodded slowly. She wasn't just chasing Boone. She was chasing the entire machine that made him possible. And for the first time in a long, long time, it looked like the machine was starting to crack. The room was silent as Clara stepped up to the podium inside the State Judiciary Review Board. No gavel, no robe, just her voice and the truth she refused to carry in silence any longer. Dozens of eyes watched, some full of admiration, others dread. She looked out across the room, colleagues, critics, strangers, and then she spoke. "I am submitting my resignation as a judge of this state." The words dropped like stones into still water. But Clara didn't pause. "I believe in the law. I always have. I believe in its power to protect, to punish, to heal. But I also believe that systems built to serve must be rebuilt by new hands when they start to serve only themselves." She inhaled once, steady, and continued. "I didn't come here today to keep a title. I came to light a fire, not to bask in its glow, but to make sure the next woman who wears this robe doesn't have to fight like I did, just to be heard." The board members said nothing. They couldn't. Because what do you say when someone gives up power? Not out of defeat, but out of principle? 2 weeks later, Travis Boone was found guilty on all counts. Assault on a federal judge, obstruction of justice, perjury, conspiracy, intimidation of a witness. He didn't speak during sentencing. For the first time in his life, he had no script, no shield, no one left to protect him. Behind him, 140 old cases were reopened. Names long buried were finally being spoken again. Some people wept, some cheered. Outside the courthouse, a quiet protest grew. No shouting, no violence, just candles, signs, and people, black, white, young, old, standing shoulder to shoulder in the Charleston night. One sign read, "Justice isn't quiet anymore. Thank you, Judge May." Clara didn't attend the rally. She didn't want to become the story. Instead, she sat on the porch of her sister's house in Mount Pleasant. The air was warm, the cicadas sang somewhere in the trees, and her nephew, fresh from school, ran up the steps with his backpack swinging. He dropped it, ran into her arms, and held her tight. "Auntie Clara," he whispered, "you made them listen." She smiled softly and pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. "No, baby," she said. "I made them look. Listening. That's still up to them." And as the sun began to set over the city, she fought to change. Clara May leaned back, closed her eyes, and, for the first time in a long time, breathed like a woman no longer at war. This wasn't just a courtroom story. It was a mirror, held up to a system too long left unexamined, to a city that believed silence kept it safe, to a woman who refused to disappear quietly. Clara May did not win every battle. She didn't set out to be a symbol. She didn't ask for the spotlight. But when the storm came, she stood. Not just for herself, but for the ones who never made it to the bench, the ones who were silenced, dismissed, erased. And in doing so, she lit a path. Because justice isn't about being perfect, it's about being brave enough to say, this is not enough. So if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Carry it forward. Speak louder, stand taller. Because the system doesn't change when we whisper. It changes when someone like Clara makes it impossible to look away. And somewhere, someone's watching, hoping you'll be that someone too.